Hi there, and welcome to episode 9 of the OGV Let's Talk Transition podcast. I'm Moray, Melhuish, the founder of Annet Consulting. We help businesses bring offshore technologies and services to market and provide interim project management to the offshore wind industry. I'm delighted to have with me today Chris Willow, Head of Floating Wind Development at RWE. Hey Chris, thanks for joining us.
Hi there, nice to be speaking.
Great. Chris, can you introduce yourself and RWE, please?
Yes, so as you said, Chris Willow, Head of Floating Wind Development at RWE. So RWE is a fairly large international utility, so headquartered in Germany. We're one in the top 10 kind of utilities in Europe, so a big player, relatively old as well. I think we're just about to celebrate our 125th anniversary, so been going for a long time. As you'd expect from a kind of a company that's big and been involved in Europe for a long time, we have been and continue to be a fairly large consumer of fossil fuels. But I think we are going through a big transition at the moment, a big corporate transition with a really substantial program of investment into renewables, into hydrogen, such that we've got a corporate ambition to be climate neutral by 2040. And so this is a big program, and yeah, I'm part of that transition, helping the company to flip over into that new chapter.
Oh, that's fantastic, Chris. Can you give us a little bit more of an overview as to some of those projects that are ongoing outside of just floating wind that you mentioned?
Yeah, I mean we're it's kind of it's the obvious kind of renewable kind of technologies that you're expecting to see. So onshore wind, offshore wind, seabed fixed. We're kind of, as my kind of area is floating wind. We're a big solar company, and we're looking into opportunities for hydrogen as a kind of a vector for kind of storage, but also for kind of industrial uses as well. I think, the big shifts over the last couple of years and a decade have been kind of moving out of the European home markets and into APAC and the US as well.
Great. And what can you tell us about RWE's footprint and investment in the offshore wind industry in general?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a bit of a messy corporate history. So I'm not going to go into the detail of the kind of like the to's and fro's of how it's come. But fundamentally, if you just say it's all lumped in together, I would say that RWE has been involved in offshore wind since 2004, or at least that was when our first offshore wind project was completed. So in the UK. Well, actually, there was a smaller project, but the first commercial scale project in the UK, Scroby Sands, North Hoyle. And so really it's been a journey since then. So we kind of started on those small scale projects at kind of 90 megawatts, almost 20 years ago. And now since then building up a portfolio so that we now, I think, own pro rata a portfolio of about 3 gigawatts, but have been responsible for building out about 5 gigawatts of offshore wind. And yeah, we're in the process of kind of accelerating that. So as part of this transition that I was talking about, I think we're looking to have installed about 8 gigawatts by 2030. And so yeah, that's a big challenge in itself, but yeah, and floating wind's going to be a part of that.
And great. And Chris, 8 gigawatts by 2030, that's fully owned?
No, so yes, I think so. Yeah, so yeah, the portfolio, and then that's a net ownership, I think. So
net ownership. Great. Great. And tell me, why does offshore wind, and in particular floating offshore wind, why does it matter?
Yeah, so I think that obviously we need to see all types of renewable generation kind of maxed out. Now we've seen costs coming down for onshore wind and solar. We just need to see those kind of technologies maxed out as well. But I think that offshore wind as a general concept does have a kind of special advantages. I suppose the big one is kind of the ability to just deploy at scale. The kind of in our portfolio, we've got the Subsea project in the North Sea, which is kind of, it's a gigawatt plus scale project. And so, just being able to deploy projects at that scale, I think, is really important. It just allows governments, countries to kind of boost that portfolio substantially in a single click, and so that helps drive things forward. I think offshore wind also has the advantages of accessing kind of more consistent, stronger offshore wind resource, and I think that's an important part of allowing to generate more consistently and firmly. And also, I think that we've got large cities, large load centres around coastal regions, and so by kind of building offshore wind farms in those regions, then it means that you can kind of plug directly into those load centres, and so you can see that, for example, off the US East Coast, big major cities don't necessarily have access to onshore wind, to solar in the same scale, but they do have large kind of offshore wind resources, and so it's a way of those kind of regions developing their renewable kind of portfolio. I think floating wind has it's a kind of the next step of offshore wind. So offshore wind seabed fixed, really, I think we're talking about that it starts to get too costly, or not cost efficient to deploy in waters with seabed fixed technology in water depths of more than 60-70 meters. But there's obviously kind of large load centers, good wind resource in areas that have deeper waters than that. So what we need to be able to do is kind of use the wind turbine technology, the same technology, but be able to deploy in deeper waters. And so that's where floating wind kicks in, and fundamentally it's going to have the same benefits. It's going to be able to deliver large amounts of capacity at scale.
And what are some of the priority markets for floating offshore wind in general? Where are these load centers with good wind resource and the deeper seabeds? Which countries and cities are we talking about?
It's quite a list, actually. I mean, it's so I kind of was thinking about this beforehand, and so I mean, in no particular order. So I think the UK is obviously an important market for that. I think we've got large areas in the North Sea, say, that are shallow water, and we've got lots of coastal load centres. But actually, there's a finite amount of seabed fixed that we can deploy in the UK, and floating wind is going to unlock more areas, and importantly, it's going to unlock different areas as well. So kind of around the coast of Scotland, in the Celtic Sea. I think France is another key market. So we're starting to see, the French government has taken a kind of a position of being a floating wind leader. So they've already got quite a few kind of pilot scale projects deployed or being deployed, and they're running auctions now for kind of 250 megawatt projects this year, and we'll be kind of ramping that up as well. Also in Europe, we've got kind of Norway, Spain, all kind of looking to get processes either underway or moving forward. In Asia Pacific, I think you've got Japan, famously kind of deep waters there. I think they're focusing in the short term on seabed fix just to build up their industry experience, but inevitably, if they're going to want to kind of build up significantly more capacity, they're going to have to move into deeper water. Korea has made some very strong kind of positions in pushing forward leasing activity there, and Korea's got the advantage of an amazing supply chain that's potentially important there as well. Taiwan and China in Asia as well. So I mean, China just generally is going to do things in a big way, and floating wind's not going to be an exception. And then finally, you've also got kind of the US, so both Eastern Coast and West Coast, and so RWE just at the tail end of last year was successful in a big auction for seabed leasing off the coast of California. So we're in the thick of that market as well. But so you can see this isn't just a kind of a one or two markets. This is definitely a kind of a big global market.
Yeah, there's a huge potential there, isn't there? And Chris, take us through your projects, your floating wind projects. Specifically, I guess California, as you just mentioned.
Yeah, well, California is the most recent one, and I mean all of these projects are typically kind of allocated through a kind of auction process at some stage. So we've got teams working on lots of projects around the world, and each one's difficult and has its own kind of particular challenges. But it's always great when we do secure something. So I suppose just taking a step back from that really big California project that we've got. where we've kind of started with our floating kind of journey is with some demonstration projects. So we've got a demonstration project called Tetraspar, which you can see just over my shoulder here on my wallpaper. So this is just off the coast of Norway, and so that's it's a relatively small turbine, 3.6, but so that's a steel it's called a suspended counterweight concept. So although you can't see much of it just because there's a lot of stuff happening under the water with a kind of keel suspended underneath it to give it stability. And so we're actually just celebrating our first year of generation with that. So we deployed that we got that finally kind of commissioned and up and running in December last year. So learning lots from that as well. Elsewhere, we've also got the DemoSath project, which is a concrete concept that's being deployed off the north coast of Spain in the Atlantic as well. And so that's a very different type of design with all sorts of different design challenges and benefits as well. And so that one should be installed or kind of connected. It's already built and it's sitting alongside the quay, and so we should be towing it out and hooking it up sometime in Q1, Q2 this year as well. So looking forward to getting that done. And then, I mean, elsewhere, we're kind of, as I said, we've got this California project. So this is I think it's about 1.2 gigawatts, so 1,200 megawatts. We participated in an auction, seabed lease auction, where other industry players also competed for different sites. And so I think that was about 6 sites allocated, of which we secured one. Big challenge about California is that the water depths go pretty deep pretty quickly. So whereas the Tetraspar here is in water depths of about 200 meters, in California our site has got a water depth of 700 meters or so. So, you know, new technology challenges. I mean, you also famously get earthquakes off along the Pacific kind of coast around there. So these are some of the technical challenges that we have to think about. But I think what's been good is over the last year we've been working very hard over and understanding those challenges and being able to kind of compete competitively for those bids and think about it. Importantly, that California project isn't probably going to be deployed until the beginning of the 2030s. So we've got some time to work through those. So, you know, and in between that, we're looking to find other kind of stepping stone projects that will allow us to build up our experience, kind of just knuckle through those technical challenges.
Great, Chris. And can you put the project in context a little bit for us? So, you know, what does it mean for California? What does it mean for number of jobs, impact on local communities? You know, what does 1.2 gigawatts mean in real terms?
Yeah, I mean, it's always difficult to kind of say. I mean, because in California in particular, I mean, California hasn't seen any offshore wind deployment. So, for example, in the case of the UK, floating wind is coming in as a new form of an existing industry. So, you know, the UK's built up experience, it's built up its policy network, so very kind of policy framework. It's got a very established policy framework. We know about how we're going to fund projects, how they're regulated, how they're going to be consented, and also the government in the UK and other kind of more kind of mature markets, they've also got a clear idea about how they expect supply chain activities to happen. So, you know, floating wind is going to be coming into that policy framework, coming into that support kind of mechanisms. And yes, there's going to need to be some changes, and maybe we're going to be working in new regions and therefore new supply chain requirements. But fundamentally, it's going to be the same. And so that helps accelerate it. I think what's interesting about California is that they haven't done kind of any offshore wind because fundamentally the coastal shelf just goes very deep very quickly. So they haven't got that kind of track record of seabed fixed so far. So they're leapfrogging straight into floating wind. And so the policy framework is kind of still in development, and that needs to be gone through. And there's all sorts of kind of consenting challenges that we're going to need to address with getting the projects consented, and also to understand how we're going to be working with the California government in what level of supply chain activity, what's the level of kind of local content, jobs, and community benefit is going to be developed there, because these sorts of things that we recognize are really important. You know, we're investing, it's a huge investment in that's needed, and obviously states want to see some of that come back to the local community. But it's not a simple case, and it's not just a formula. You need to work it out in each market. But I suppose fundamentally, I mean, these are big, really expensive projects. So I think if you assume that the capex for these projects is going to be 2 to 3 million euros a megawatt. In the UK, we're talking, well, yeah. So in the UK, the government's got a target of by 2030 of deploying 5 gigawatts. So that would be 10 to 15 billion. So, and given that we've got 120 megawatts deployed so far, so that's how much today. We're in 2023 now, and we've got 120 megawatts or so deployed, and we're talking about in the UK alone aiming for 5 gigawatts. 5,000 megawatts. That's the scale of the challenge and how quickly things have got to ramp up. So it's going to be an interesting ride over the next 10 years.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And 2 to 3 million euros per megawatt, that's a sort of industry standard metric, is it? That's how these things are broadly calculated?
Exactly. I mean, the cost in offshore wind depends on so many factors. I mean, it's site dependent, it's time dependent. When are we talking about when the cost is happening? Because, offshore wind as a whole the costs have kind of changed over the last 20 years, and floating wind is going through that same evolution as well. But I think, it's a rough rule of thumb that, based on kind of third party forecasts like DNV, those sorts of guys. So I think if you can use it as a rule of thumb, then yeah, that's probably where we're heading to. So,
and Chris, for delivering a project like that, what would the typical contracting structure be? How many direct suppliers would RWE typically have? Is it one at the top and then a whole pyramid underneath, or is it 5? Tell me about the structure and the types of services that you would typically see at each level.
Yeah. So again, I'm gonna kind of couch this in that every project is going to be different, and every kind of different company is going to have a different approach. So, but I suppose from an RWE perspective and from what I kind of see, I think that a company like RWE, being on the journey that it's gone through, has kind of pretty much experimented with most of the different ones. So there has been projects where it's just been an EPC kind of contract, one big mega project, and they hand it over at the end. And then I think we've also gone through the process of doing the multi-contract with many hundreds of individual contracts. I think probably how the industry is settling on is the kind of the format is what I'd call mini EPC contracts. So really the developer, RWE in this case, would have 3 to 4 big contracts that it hands over to the big tier 1 suppliers. We manage the interface between those projects, but then those tier 1 suppliers then take the responsibility. And so that would be, you can imagine the interfaces there, or the packages: turbine supply, you've got foundation supply and install, maybe electrical supply and install, and you can cut it in different ways. I think what's interesting about floating wind is that those interfaces might be slightly different. So whereas in offshore wind, you're taking out your foundations and your turbines on jack-up vessels and installing them out at sea. So you'd do a installation campaign for your foundations, and then you'd do your installation campaign for your turbines. And so that might package up your contracting strategy in one way. For floating wind, what's interesting is you do the turbine install on top of the foundation at the quayside, and so then you do some of the pre-commissioning of the kind of early commissioning on the turbine at the quayside, and that has benefits. And then you're towing out that combined foundation turbine structure to site for final hookup. So maybe the interfaces are going to be different, and I think that's going to be part of the kind of work that we're going to be doing as we start to build these big projects. Where's the optimum interface between those packages? How do we split them down? And where does the supply chain want to take responsibility as well?
Great. Okay, that's really interesting. Thanks. Just slightly going back, but Chris, take us through, if you don't mind, the timeline of a typical floating offshore wind project.
Yeah.
We mentioned that California will be delivered early 2030. That's great. Mm-hmm. But I'm sure it didn't just happen yesterday. That
No.
Take us through the whole time scale if you don't
Yeah.
mind.
I mean, I think what's really important is that floating wind, and this is a bit of a cliche that I kind of keep on talking about, but floating wind is an evolution, not a revolution, compared to seabed fixed. So we're not talking about some radical new technology that's going to be disruptive compared to it. Actually, I think and what's important for a company like RWE is that it's just a continuation of what we've been learning and doing with seabed fixed so far. We just have to figure out what's different and be able to manage that differences. So fundamentally, the timescales for a floating project, we think, are going to be fundamentally similar to that of an offshore wind project. And so then the country specific factors become more important, because then you start to think about, well, when does the government want to hold the competitive allocation process in that life cycle? So France does it differently to the UK, does it differently to the US, and different to other markets as well. But fundamentally, once you've kind of allocated the rights to a site and you've got to support, then you would probably see 1 to 2 years of getting ready for a support mechanism auction, say, and once you've secured that and you've got the route to market in your control, so then you would be starting to aim towards your kind of final investment decision, and that may take 1 to 2 years again, depending on the size of the project. Once you've reached your final investment decision, then your kind of build out would take 2 to 3 years, and then once you've kind of completed, you've got an operating wind farm, then I think we would assume that the lifetime of the project would be exactly the same as that of a seabed fix. So 25 years stretching on to 30 if we can make it. So fundamentally, not a big difference. In each market, it's going to be different. The reason that California is a long time away is not because of the project cycle itself, but because we need to get policy framework set up. We need to get transmission issues set up. We're going to be building a lot of capacity to the north of the state, but actually the load centers are to the south of the state. So big transmission infrastructure needs to be set up to kind of get those electrons from the north where the wind is down to the south where the air conditioning units are.
Yeah, if only we needed them here in Scotland.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's a really good overview, Chris. How do we compress that? To me, offshore wind's got such an important role, not just in reducing our carbon footprint, but of course, energy security being incredibly important.
Yeah.
How do we shorten that timescale?
Yeah, I mean, this is a challenge in every market, really. And I think it's experience plays a role. Seeing where best practice happens and doing. I'm not into that detail, so I'm not going to be able to say, in the UK these are the specific things. I mean, I know, you see in the Chris Skidmore review recently. I mean, he's talking about knocking down those administrative barriers to getting consent more quickly, and I mean, it's a major process to do it. But what you can't compromise on is making sure that people are consulted, making sure that the things are done in the right way. So I think these are big projects. They do have big kind of development cycles. I suppose what's probably, to me, more important than constricting those project cycles is just getting certainty about it. So having the understanding of where people are in the cycle, have the confidence that those time cycles aren't going to be delayed disproportionately or kind of arbitrarily kind of affected. And yeah, giving people confidence that if they start that process and they do the job in the right way and they get the right answers, that they can then start building it on it. And that's kind of how you kind of invest with confidence in that process. So and yeah, it's a tricky process, but I'm sure that we need to build out so much capacity, seabed fixed and floating. The challenge to get to net zero means we need to do so much that we need to get better at it, and we're going to need to make choices too about where we where we make it, and so there's going to need to be compromises on that. We're going to need to say where are we okay to build capacity out, and how are we going to connect that into our system.
Yeah, I always thinking about the capacity of these things. I always think it's interesting just to look back and look back at what we did before, just to see how far we've come. And I was looking back at your Scroby Sands project developed in 2004, which had 30 2-megawatt turbines. Now, the RW Sophia project, okay, it's fixed bottom as well.
Yep.
It's got 114 megawatt turbines.
Yeah.
That's a 23 times increase in generating capacity compared to the two projects in about as many years.
Yeah.
Can that growth continue?
I think it has to. I mean, well, let's see. So the market growth has to continue. So from where we were in 2004, back then these were small. Well, they're still expensive projects, but they were, comparative to today, small projects, and we're building up. I think if you look at where we need to get to achieve net zero, it's the rate of market deployment has to just continue accelerating. Now, whether that means we need to have larger projects, I don't know. I mean, I think the industry will ultimately settle on a kind of what is a good package size that allows people to go through a sensible consenting process, to get the funding and the financing in place, and to kind of get the supply chain being able to invest in places. So I don't know where it settles. I mean, as you said, kind of Sophia is kind of 1,400 megawatts, 1.4 gigawatts. We've got the neighboring site to us there is the Dogger Bank project at 3.6 gigawatts. So that's that's almost three times as big. So it's kind of there clearly isn't a limit. We haven't hit the limit just yet, but I think it does need to go forward. I mean, I keep on thinking about, and this is kind of going to get into kind of geeky statistics, but kind of I think you kind of look at where we need to be in terms of 2050 as a kind of arbitrary future point. And here I'm not the expert, but kind of looking at, I think I do rely on kind of DNV's Energy Transition Outlook. I think that's a good, robust kind of third-party source, and I think they kind of talk about in their forecast that was published at the end of last year. So just got some statistics here. So they talk about 2022, they say 76 gigawatts of fixed capacity installed and 150 megawatts of floating. They say by 2030, we're going to get to 345 gigawatts of fixed and 13 gigawatts of floating. And then by 2050, it kind of gets to the kind of unimaginable kind of levels of, they say 1,500 gigawatts of seabed fixed and almost 300 gigawatts of floating. You kind of look at that on a chart, and all of the work that we've done today, all of that effort, it's barely getting off the line, really. The hard work is going to come. So all of the effort we've been doing in building up the industry, this is going to it's going to click in now forward. And so floating wind is going to be part of it. It's not going to dominate it. I think floating wind, 15 to 20% of the market, that feels reasonable. It's a big chunk of the market, but not dominating. But seabed fixed needs to just now get on with the job and start just kind of pushing out gigawatts.
Right. And Chris, the industry has got a really strong role to play in decarbonisation, of course. Yep. But we can't get around the fact that projects of this scale do have their own impact.
Yes.
Is the industry doing enough to reduce its environmental impact? I'll ask that question first of all, and I'll come back to another.
I think it really is recognised in it. I mean, I think this idea that, I mean, you can come at it various different ways. So there's the biodiversity topic, and so we're building large scale infrastructure offshore in a habitats, and so we're going to have an impact on that, and it's important that we're putting it in the right place, that we're managing how we're doing that, and that if we are having an impact, that that's being done on a measured basis. I mean, I see in the industry that people are coming into this, coming into this industry to make a difference from a kind of climate change perspective and an environmental purpose as well. So I think that there's a real drive to make sure that the impact is limited, and so I think there's a lot of work there. But then on the other hand, you've also got the fact that we are using huge amounts of steel. We're using rare earth metals. We're using kind of all sorts of different materials in it, and that has an impact in the supply chain. But I think that is being addressed as well. We're kind of seeing measures like recyclable blades, which is all good. We're seeing, hopefully, the development of green steel in the future. And I think that governments as well have a role to play in that, in the criteria that they use for allocating. I mean, today there's been over the last 10 years, an amazing journey for offshore wind in seeing auctions being delivered on a cost basis, and that's really seeing the cost coming down. But also, more recently, we're starting to see other factors coming into how governments select the developers of projects. And so in the Netherlands, for example, they've just allocated 2 projects, very low cost for ratepayers, but they're starting to use other factors like innovation or environmental impact in the direct judging of that competitive process. And so I think that's part of how we're going to be doing it. So I think that there's an embedded industry desire to do the right thing, but we need to kind of get the policy frameworks in the right way to incentivize that.
Okay, and you mentioned biodiversity. Is there anything that we can do as an industry to actually encourage biodiversity in and about our wind farms?
There is. I'm not the technical expert, but I know that there's plenty of research going on there. And I mean, it's these are kind of areas where there's marine life that needs to be considered. There's other sea users as well. So kind of fishermen are using these areas. So it's a complicated, multifaceted area that we're looking into, I think. And obviously at the same time, we're thinking about the impact of climate change, the impact that climate change, if unabated, will have on all kind of habitats as well. So there is a kind of balance to play. I don't know the detail. I know that we've got lots of people working on it, and I'm sure it'll be an interesting future conversation with somebody else on this channel. So I think it's a really important one, and we all need to be thinking about it.
Great. And just to touch on the fishing industry, is there a way to balance those competing interests? Does offshore wind benefit the fishing industry at all?
I think that's got to be part of it. I mean, we are the fishing industry and the offshore wind industry has clashed in the past a lot, and we're talking about the scales of deployment that we're talking about. That kind of the potential for that clash to happen more, is going to increase. So we need to make sure that relationship is right. That necessary offshore wind farms aren't kind of delayed or cancelled unnecessarily. But on the other hand, that this is people's livelihoods. These are people have strong claims to be using these areas. Floating wind has particular challenges for fisheries in that we're going to have, with some mooring configurations, we're going to have mooring lines across the farm, and that's going to affect the ability of some types of fishing as well. So I think the challenge is to have constructive conversations with both sides, appreciating that both sides are coming with genuine intent, and we need to just find solutions. But I don't think it's going to be easy, and it's the frequency of these conversations is going to get more as we need to build out more.
Yeah, okay. Let's quickly think about the scale of these projects, and of course we've talked about the investment. That leads me to think about demands on the supply chain, and of course the supply chain has to grow in line with the demand for these projects. Otherwise, of course, they're not going to be delivered. Are there areas you see as being particularly challenging, Chris? And is there more that can be done to support development of the supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, talking about it generally clearly there are always this challenge between supply and demand. And I mean, one of the challenges for the offshore wind industry has been this growth in turbine size, that turbine size has such a dramatic impact on the cost of offshore wind projects. And so that's kind of stimulated an arms race amongst the OEMs, and that's been a challenge as they've had to invest to increase the capacity, and then they're also building up manufacturing capacity there as well. And the other challenge is that these companies that are building these components, so foundations, cables, they have to be able to look to their shareholders and say, well, if we build this factory, it's going to be fully used, and we're going to be able to make a profit on that. And that hasn't always been certain in the offshore wind market over the last 10, 20 years. I think we're now entering a period where offshore wind it's becoming industrialized, we've tipped over that point whether there's any uncertainty about whether offshore wind is going to be a major player in the future in terms of electricity generation. It is that it's a fact now, and I think what we need to do is make sure that governments communicate clearly about what they want, that experienced suppliers are talking to the to developers, to government, to understand how demand is going to be, and to understand what other factors are going to influence where supply chain investment is going to come. So local content is going to be an important issue. So you can take one approach, which is just it's a free-for-all global market, and you import it from anywhere, but that's politically challenging. So you need to get some level of local activity. So I think as we scale, we're going to need to get more investment. That's really important, and we're going to need to think about the relative merits of continued technology and kind of innovation. So we're not going to see turbine sizes multiply as many times as they have over the time, but we're still going to see turbine size growth. But we're going to need to see that innovation balanced with the need for supply chain optimization. So just kind of getting a real kind of conveyor belt system going where these components can be manufactured at scale, deployed quickly, and that people understand how things are going to be built cost effectively and quickly.
And I guess probably with California principally in mind, Chris, at what point does the supply chain engagement begin? And if there are suppliers out there desperate to get involved in the project, what's the route? How do they do it?
Well, I suppose this loops back to then when we were talking about how does the contracting of a project done. But and this is a challenge for a developer like RWE, because fundamentally our procurement focus is going to be on the contracting of those big kind of tier one mini EPC providers, and so often the local content that's going to be driven by a project is actually going to come through the tier 2, 3s and below, and they're going to be feeding into the tier 1s. So for a developer like us, we're clearly responsible for it. That's an important part of our responsibility, but yet we're kind of only indirectly responsible for it. So I think this is where you need to have a strong collaboration between the tier 1s and the developers, and with government as well. In a market like California, I mean, we're a month or two post the auction, so this is we now know who the winners are. We now know who the developers are who are going to be pushing that. That's the first step. So that means that now the government knows, right, this is the cohort of developers that's going to be building our projects. Those developers now need to start pushing through the consenting process, need to help the government get a policy framework, get the transmission system all working, and to start thinking about, well, ports, infrastructure, about who are the suppliers, bringing suppliers along, thinking about what's the right balance between cost competitiveness and local content, and also thinking about, well, what are the strengths of a local market? California is going to have different existing supply chain strengths to, say, Scotland, and then it's a matter of finding out what's the ambition of those companies, and how do we plug them in, because it's not just going to be RWE all the time doing kind of speaking to that tier 3 metal fabricator. It's going to be about us bringing our supply chain along so that those companies can talk to the people who they're going to be doing the contracts with. So it's a complicated kind of process, but it does work. It just needs a lot of talking.
Okay, great. And Chris, as a floating offshore wind developer, how do you choose the foundations that you're going to use? You've already mentioned Tetraspar and Demo South. Can you just talk us through some of the considerations and perhaps some of the options, and how do you choose which one is most appropriate for a certain site? I know that's a big question.
No, it is, but it's a really important one, because I think with Seabed Fix, what we've seen is a real consolidation onto, say, 2 main types of foundations. So you've got the monopile and you've got the jacket, and they are both generic designs. So you can take that you take that kind of principle or generic concept, and then you apply it to your particular project, working with design houses to get your specific design. Floating wind, however, is at this stage where actually, I think last count, we've got about more than 100 different designs on our kind of databases. So, and each one of those has different merits, different disadvantages, different levels of maturity. And so it's and each one of those is also being developed by a particular company whose interest is to generate IP that then that's going to be their business model for the future. So it's a very different situation. I think maybe when we started out, we thought, well, maybe the industry is just going to consolidate, do the same thing as Seabed Fixed and consolidate on one design. And I don't think it's going to be that way. It's not going to be 100. And it's probably not even going to be 10. But I think probably what we'll see is the industry consolidate on a number of different concepts. And I think this is because there are going to be different drivers for different foundation choices in different regions. So, you're going to have different supply chains in different regions. And so that may favor a particular type of design choice, concrete or steel, or a particular way of fabricating. I think you're also going to have different kind of the different concepts have a different deployment configuration in terms of your mooring systems and that sort of thing. And I think that these sorts of things are going to affect it. So I don't think there's going to be one winner takes all. I think it's going to be a complicated process that's not just about the technical feasibility of a structure. I think what we've learned over the last 10 years, particularly accelerating in the last couple of years, that floating is technically feasible, that we can deploy it. We understand that. And the leading designs are all well understood. We understand how they're going to work. The challenge is how cost effectively and quickly can we produce them? Because, it's fine to prove a demonstrator that uses one foundation. But now actually what we're talking about for a gigawatt scale or a project, you're going to need to do 50 of them. And 50 of them in a year. So you're probably looking at producing a 1,000 to 2,000 ton structure a week, and you're going to have to do that on a conveyor belt system. So that's the challenge that we need to think about.
Great. Ahead of this podcast, ahead of our chat today, I took a look at the RWE virtual classroom, which I've got to say is brilliant. I really recommend anybody out there take a look at the virtual classroom. Brilliant overview of the different foundation types. But other than that, can you take us through the content, Chris, and the thought process behind it?
I think, as I kind of said, the floating is an evolution of Seabed Fixed. But I think what we realized over the last couple of years is that actually what we need to do is take people on the journey on getting people educated on the design choices that we're having to make and the different factors that we're having to consider, so that then when we needed to make our next decisions, that they were in the same place as us. So actually trying to, I think we've done tons of work to try and understand the different concepts, the different ways of it, but there's lots of new issues arising in floating that government stakeholders need to understand, that statutory bodies who are kind of going to be inputting into the consenting of these things, the supply chain needs to understand the differences from, say, oil and gas and seabed fixed offshore wind. So, I mean, it's the virtual classroom is a starter for 10. You know, this is going to get people hopefully familiar with the simple terminology that we're going to be using, so we can talk the same language. And also just to answer those simple questions, so that when we're kind of meeting with people and the rest of the industry are meeting with people, you don't need to deal with those basic questions. You know, why does it stay in place? How does it stay in place? Why don't they sink? I mean, it's you're deploying a kind of like a 2,000-ton piece of steel. To some people, it's not immediately obvious why this thing is not going to sink to the bottom of the sea. So I think lots of work has been done, but we shouldn't underestimate the benefit of just making sure that we're all on the same page and that we've kind of got that baseline kind of understanding, because we've got loads of complex issues to kind of get through. So yeah, it was a really good process pulling together those animations and just making them simple. And I think we're also trying to get them translated into different languages as well, because you know it's important to get that message out and people understanding it.
Brilliant. And for anybody who wants to look at the virtual classroom or take part in the virtual classroom, how do they find it?
I think just type into Google RWE floating wind and you'll find it there.
Soon find it. Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah.
Now, Chris, I've really enjoyed the chat about the industry and the foundation types and the potential and the growth, but I'd like to find out more about you.
Okay.
Can you take us a little bit through your career? You know, how did you end up, or you know, how have you become the head of floating wind at RWE?
Yeah, it's been a bit of a kind of a curvy kind of career path for me. So I'm not an engineer. I studied at university history, so as far away from engineering really as you can be, and then kind of moved into journalism, and so enjoyed that gathering up of information, that synthesizing of lots of different bits of information into something that other people can understand. I think I got a bit fed up with the gossipy nature of journalism, and so kind of pivoted from that into commercial research, and that kind of felt like that had a lot of those same aspects. You need to gather the information, you need to convince people about a story, you need to be quite good at writing so that you're communicating clearly. But for me, working in business just had that cleanness of you're trying to convince people to do a business decision, and I really enjoyed that. I got into the offshore wind industry back in 2007 now, so I've been in the industry for about 15 years, which is incredible, working for a ports company. So working for Associated British Ports in the UK, and I was working in the central commercial department for there, and we were getting inquiries from offshore wind developers looking to use our ports, and so the kind of started to engage with them and understand, well, what are the requirements that they have? How did we as a port respond to those challenges? And so got into that then, and back then I remember conversations about people saying, well, why are we bothering with this offshore wind? You know, it's just going to be an expensive thing that will fade away like others have as well. So it felt a bit of a gamble at the time to be doubling down on offshore wind, but it's quite satisfying to look back at that and think about the journey that it's come on. I think after I left the ports company, I went into consultancy for about 8 years, working for a consultancy and that was brilliant in that it gave me a lot of exposure to offshore wind developers, suppliers, working for government policy. And then I joined Energy, which would later become part of RWE in 2017, working in the business growth team, so thinking about business opportunities. And at the time, I thought that floating wind was a kind of an expensive hobby for one or two developers, and I thought we shouldn't be doing anything about that. But started to kind of see a couple of designs, including Henrik Steesdale's Tetraspar design that answered some of my questions. And on the back of our decision to invest in that demonstration project, we built up a capability program that's grown, and it's kind of just developed from there. The company has seen the potential of floating wind and is putting resource, money, and people behind it.
Great. And Chris, what advice would you have for anybody considering a move into offshore wind or to making offshore wind their career?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very exciting, dynamic industry as well, and I think there's a. I mean, I work on a daily basis with a huge variety of people. You know, it's not all about engineering. You know, I kind of work with financiers who are thinking about how to deliver that. You know, kind of consenting specialists who are thinking about all of that, strategy, commercial, all of those different aspects. And I suppose everybody, well, not everybody, I can't speak for everybody, but I think that there is a genuine kind of feeling within the industry that we're making a difference, that actually this is working towards a goal that will make a difference in the long term, and that yeah, we're part of that transition. So I think it's a good industry to do it. I mean, it's funny, I think back when I was at university, offshore wind didn't really exist, and so you know I could never have kind of planned it. And I think similarly for people in university now, where the industry is today, it's going to be radically different in the future. So I mean, I see others who are kind of have an absolute clarity about where they're going and what they're going to do, and that's great. I think I was very much different. I floated around, excuse the pun, until, you know, trying different things. I think probably where I kind of came was focus what you're good at and what you enjoy, and that will be generally what you enjoy, and the kind of opportunities will come up, and you'll kind of prove yourself there. I think my other advice is build up your network and talk to peers, and don't be afraid to ask people about what they do. I think you know, I've had opportunities to kind of just talk to more senior people in the industry, understand what they think is going to happen, and I think that's always good. And yeah, and I suppose also my final thought when I was thinking about these sorts of things is also that don't make sure that you don't miss out on the other stuff out of it. You know, the career is important, but you know, and we're all working flat out on things, but don't miss the kids' meals and bedtime. You know, if you've got lots of emails to do, turn off the computer at 5 o'clock, do that sort of stuff. And then if you really need to send those emails, pick it up after they've gone to bed, because that's also the important stuff as well. So getting that balance right is really important.
Yeah, that's some good advice. I'd like to think about success just quickly. It's a theme throughout all of our podcasts on Let's Talk Transition. How is success defined for RWE's floating offshore wind business?
So I think, you know, there's a temptation with floating wind because it's a new technology, and you've got kind of single turbine demonstrations, that you kind of, there's a risk that you start to think of that demonstration project as an end in itself, and actually it's just it's the first step in a journey. So how I think of success for floating wind is cost competitive commercial scale projects being deployed on a global basis. You know, this for a big company like RWE, we don't want to play around at the 100 megawatt scale or even you know 200. These are necessary steps to building up towards it. But fundamentally, utilities, big companies, they want to make those big financial investment decisions, and that you get there by deploying on a commercial scale. So, and importantly, you get to that by driving down the cost. And because this floating wind can't be an expensive hobby for a few countries, you know, to really fulfill its potential, it needs to be cost competitive. Now, cost competitive doesn't necessarily mean the same price as seabed fixed or onshore wind, but what it needs to do is get to a point where it's a no-brainer for governments. You know, it's an option that fits within their portfolio, and so once you get that cost competitive commercial scale technology, then like you see with seabed fixed, then the potential just it becomes inevitable with a logic of its own. So, you know, back in 2007 when I was starting in the industry, there was lots of uncertainty about whether offshore wind would happen, and now it feels like there's everybody understands the logic and it's happening. I think floating wind, as you know, as much as I've put 4 years of my life into it, I think we're still building up that logic. I'm not taking it for guaranteed, but I suppose just getting it to the point where the world understands that logic for building floating wind projects, that will be success.
Brilliant, thank you. And just in a nutshell, Chris, how do you define success for yourself?
I like just kind of bringing people together, bringing ideas together that maybe wouldn't have happened otherwise, and then kind of seeing things unlocked. You know, I skit around topics a lot, so I'm got lots of plates spinning all the time. But you know, I love it when I've been talking to one person and they're sharing a problem that they've got or that sort of thing, and then I talk to somebody else and they've got either the same problem or an answer, and then just bringing those two people together to kind of come up with an answer. You know, that's a real buzz for me, and it feels like that's part of what we're doing on a larger scale with the floating wind. We're just bringing people together to find the solutions that we need, and so that's what kind of gets me onto the computer in the morning, is trying to nut through the problems that we've got, and you solve one problem and then you hit against the next one, and that's fine. It's fun, but I love working with, you know, really talented, knowledgeable people as well. And I know that I don't know everything, really don't know everything, but I love working with other people and kind of building that Swiss Army knife of a group where everybody's skills and talents complement and build on each other, so that actually we deliver as a team. And yeah, it's a bit of a cliche, but it does feel very motivating when I ask somebody a question and they've got the answer there, because that's what they've been working on, and they've got the skills and knowledge to be able to answer it. Brilliant.
Good answer. I like that. Chris, the last podcast episode that we recorded was with, coincidentally, another floating offshore wind developer. Actually, it was with Gabriel Davis of Ørsted.
Absolutely.
And she posed a question for you.
Yes.
And the question is, if you had to highlight one key ask of government that you think would help the industry, what would it be?
Right. Yes, and so I was thinking about this, and I think the answer is which government are we talking about? You know, I mean, living here in the UK, I tend to be a bit kind of UK kind of centric in my thinking. But so if I was asking what was the UK ask that I would like to see, I think, you know, there are so many questions, but I mean, talking about my heritage in my career of where I came from, I think getting the ports question, to me, is key. I think that, I mean, we didn't have the answer back in 2007. We've got through some of it. We've seen some port infrastructure built, but it's still not easy to get large scale port infrastructure built in the UK, just because of the way that the system's set up. And floating wind's going to have new requirements for port infrastructure. We're going to need to, as the industry gets bigger, we're going to need more. And I also think that the port infrastructure is often the kind of the key for unlocking wider supply chain development, because if your ports are located in Denmark or Belgium or in the Netherlands, then that's where the supply chain is inevitably going to grow up. So I think, and it's not just a problem for government, but government has a role to play in it. But working with industry, working with the ports industry, I would say that. But then in other markets, it's different. So in France, I think it's how do we get it so that the development program timelines don't slip? You know, that's always been a challenge for the French market, that development timelines slip. And I think that's going to be really important in giving people confidence. And then in new markets where you know, Greece and Italy, say, where they don't have an existing market, I think it's about getting policy frameworks in place that don't necessarily reinvent the wheel. You know, it's about where can we get best practice shared from other markets so that actually we don't need to go through a painful loop of revolving that policy. It's just how do we get something that we all understand, that we know work, and gets moving forward.
Great. So asks for all the governments then.
Well, there's always plenty for the governments to do, and they're dealing with so many different challenges at the same time and trying to build up markets, and it's complicated. But yes, you can always ask for more.
That's right. And Chris, ahead of this call, I asked you to set a question for our next guest, without knowing, of course, who it would be.
Yeah.
Can you let us have it?
Yeah, so I remember when I was starting, preparing for this interview, I was thinking about how did I get into this industry, and I remember there was one meeting when I was at the ports company, and it was the first meeting that I had with someone from the offshore industry, and it was Julian Brown, who's a kind of pillar of the industry. And I remember that was a really important meeting for me, and that kind of gave me the first visibility of it and started me on investigations within that company that then led on. So I suppose what I'd like to ask your next interviewee is do they remember a key meeting or conversation that proved to be a pivot later for how they ended up where they are now? So I think you don't always recognize them when they happen. And certainly I didn't recognize that conversation with it, but looking back, that was a really important meeting.
Great. Well, I look forward to asking that question, and it'll be interesting to see how it's answered.
Yeah, absolutely. Look forward to hearing.
I think if we all look at it, we've all got pivotal meetings
absolutely.
like that in our history. So look, Chris, that brings us to the end of our meeting today. And I'd like to thank you, Chris Willow, Head of Floating Wind at RWE, for joining us.
My pleasure. Nice talking to you.
And as always, feedback on today's podcast and suggestions for who we should feature in future episodes are most welcome. Please let us know as well what kind of questions you would like us to be asking of the leaders and innovators in the energy transition industries. Feel free to get in touch. A lot of you get in touch through LinkedIn. That's great. Or you can email me. The email address is Moray, that's Moray, @ annetconsulting.com. Thank you very much.